This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-recognized writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Good morning, Charles, and welcome back to Macro Analytics.
Thank you, Gordon.
Well, it's been a quick month. Amazing how time flies here with lots of news and lots of things to talk about. Charles, I have up in front of us the slide of the roadmap that we've been following, and we have a lot of new first-time listeners, but I thought it would be worth showing the kinds of subjects that we've been talking on. The last time we had you here, we focused on one of the subjects was crony capitalism, and today we're going to talk about statism up on the top right corner, this migration, and later in the week we'll have you back and we're going to talk about central planning down on the bottom left hand. And in previous shows we've talked about this migration and how they fit together. We have up on my site the 2012 thesis paper entitled Financial Repression. Well, in it, there's a large section where we outline and discuss statism and specifically how it's beginning to evolve and why it's evolving. And we use a series of things called Nolan diagrams, which is one there kind of on the left, of the trade-offs, and it's not just right-wing and left-wing, but more of individual freedoms and individual choices and how those things, as we get towards collectivism, are starting to move, which is this chart on the right more clearly shows that. And I won't get into it today, but it is there on the site, and it gives some backdrop of this grid that we're following and framework so that you'll better understand how these things fit together. One of the things that, I found, and we were mentioning just before we began, Charles, this when I was a younger man, I did a lot of reading, and the things at the time was George Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's book Brave New World, and then there was Toffler's Future Shock. I'm sure you recall these books.
Yes,
they were amazing books. They were 30 or 40 years ago now, but they really described the kinds of things that are happening today, but from different viewpoints of what they saw, and it's amazing how they've really come to be. And in the thesis paper, I actually lay out some of those migrations and evolutions. But I would point out here, what I concluded was that they both got it right. It's just that one was going to precede the other, and that in Huxley, he was identifying the process by which we would go through, and that is we would have more illusions and perceptions and how these things, the media would manipulate and control, how governments would want to put their best foot forward, but things were not necessarily as they were represented to be and how we were living in this kind of false world. Whereas George Orwell was a lot more that it was overt control, Big Brother. So it was a lot more what I would really call statism, the centralized power. But what we have right now is we're really moving from one to the other. We're moving from illusions and false numbers. And you and I have had shows on these false numbers that we're seeing, the distortions that are going on in the economy, and now we're beginning to see more control in statism and central planning. The bottom line is that we're moving from a society where we're skillfully manipulated, as I said, by lies and illusions, to overtly controlled. Not today, but in the next few years, if we're not careful. Did that pass your common sense test? And how you recall those authors, Charles?
Yes, I think you've summarized them very well, and I think it's a brilliant slide here to combine these two, because we see elements of both, and it's not an either-or situation, as you say. We see a lot of manipulation of our perceptions, and yet we also see the hardening of potentially oppressive state control and repression.
Amazing how brilliant these two men were, that they could see so clearly the future. And they may not have got it right in terms of timing, but they got it right, and that's where we're going. And some of the other people that I put out in the thesis, and I'm certainly no socialist and no communist, but Karl Marx did a lot of writing, and he had a 14-step evolution that he thought would unfold, and I show where we're in step 8 of a 14-step that leads to statism, and it's certainly not somewhere where I want to go. But if we're not attuned to it and we don't understand it and we're not aware of it, it'll happen. And that's why our forefathers were so good and so astute at warning us and preparing, stopping these things from possibly happening. But we've always got to stand on guard. Charles, you brought some just outstanding slides with you today to really expound a little bit more on this statism and how you see it. And I would ask you to take us through them here this morning.
I'm going to start by providing a little context for my approach to understanding statism. And I tend to use the word central state to describe the overriding government. In our case, it's the federal government, as opposed to all government, which includes city, county, state, lower level governments. And so the central state is the dominant force within government. I'm going to start by making 2 points about statism. One is that a central state can only grab the surplus of an economy. In other words, if you have a very low-level agrarian economy that doesn't generate a lot of surplus, or what we might call profit, then the state can't be very large. And so if you go back to, say, America in, say, 1820, where it was a largely agrarian, did not generate a lot of surplus, the government simply could not be any larger than it was, which was extremely modest. Then, as the America industrialized, then the surplus became much larger, and it grew a lot faster. And as a result, the state could grab more of that surplus and grow itself. And so, I think part of the crunch that we're facing with statism is, as the economy slows and becomes less productive, and its growth rate slows or even declines, the state is continuing to grow. It only knows how to grow. It's like a cancer. And so the state is now no longer matched correctly with the economy or the GDP. And I think this is where statism is like Wile E. Coyote. It's running off the cliff of the surplus that the economy actually generates that it can use and spend. And now we're looking down and realizing there's no ground underneath, that the surplus is declining, and yet the state is expanding. And so I would call this the ontological imperative, which is a fancy way of saying that the state only knows how to expand. It has no mechanisms for contraction or shrinking or relinquishing its control. It only knows how to take more control and spend more. It doesn't have any mechanism for shrinking. And this is a problem, because as the economy flattens or even declines, the state should be shrinking as well. But instead, it grows like cancer every year. And so I think another point I'd like to make is I kind of approach the state and statism from a systems analysis point of view. And so if we look at the state, a lot of people think, it's which political party's in power, or who's the president, or did this agency, do its job. All those are important questions, but from say 30,000 feet, we can see that the state itself works like a system. And it doesn't really matter who's the president, or which party has power, or which agency laid off or hired a few more people. Those things are simply aspects of an entire system. And so from my point of view, the state and the people in the state, they go, well, what's the risk? And the risk is the state could lose control, or the people could become restive, or there could be social unrest. So from the state's point of view, the way to counter all these risks is to take more control. And so, for example, there used to be a boom and bust cycle, in the rapid growth eras of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, where the economy would crash, credit would contract, and then it would be a boom cycle would start shortly thereafter. And this, from the point of view of capitalism is a normal cycle, but people complained about the pain. And so then the state said, well, let's have the Federal Reserve, because now we'll control the boom-bust cycle and we'll intercede, and now we're going to control everything about the money supply and the economy, and that'll fix everything. And so that's the state's ontological imperative, is to take more control and try to fix everything. And of course, that, as a systems analysis point of view, what you've created is a monoculture, where you once had a whole forest and a variety of plants and inputs and feedbacks. Now you've got a monoculture. You've got, the whole field's been plowed into nothing, and now there's one crop, and that's called the central state. And of course, once you have one crop, then your vulnerability to disruption and crisis is gigantic.
I'm thinking as we're going here, Charles, without question, the bureaucrats, if I can use that word, have this desire to protect their own turf, to in fact continue the policies and the mission, the things that they're doing. But I would hold that the people themselves will allow the government to be a nanny state, and that government should be held within a certain percentage of the wealth creation or GDP of the country. So your point is really valid. When things start to slow, the government should be forced to come back to a smaller size. But that doesn't happen for exactly the reasons you're describing. But additionally, people, the voters, will not relinquish what they believe is now their given, their benefits, their whatever the social net or legacies that have been committed to, that they're owed these kinds of things. They also believe that all of the support systems that governments typically larger governments play to make sure things work in your society are still going to be there. Well, sometimes you just can't afford to have those kinds of people doing work when you bring back your society. So we suddenly get this, and we're seeing it in Europe right now. They have got to cut massively, but the people aren't going to buy austerity one bit, are they?
No, I think that's an excellent point.
Look what happened in France. Not only are they said, no way we want austerity in the middle of this great crisis, they went 100% socialism, overwhelmingly from the president right through the parliament. Is that clear? So there's two sides to the statism. It's the bureaucrats and the government themselves unwilling to give up control, and the people unwilling to give up what it is they believe they're getting from it.
I think that's an excellent summary, Gordon, that the sense of entitlement is overwhelming common sense and reality.
What happens is, as you really point, there's no corrective process. It's incapable. It's a one-way ratchet until the mechanism breaks. And unfortunately, that's called a crisis, and it's a very sad state. Anyway, sorry I interrupted there, Charles, but...
No, let's move to the next slide. And I think I love your phrase, one-way ratchet. That summarizes my slide much better than my own paragraphs.
You can tell I was an engineer once, right?
This next slide kind of builds on your point about the sense of entitlement, that the state can only expand in two ways, to meet the needs of the people, to meet the demands for more welfare and more support and more, entitlements. It can grow in parallel with the GDP, or it can kind of cheat by borrowing or printing money above and beyond the surplus generated by the production of goods and services. And so that, given the two pressures you just described, the people's sense of entitlement and bureaucracy's desire to maintain or increase their own power, the state is now relying on borrowing and printing money. And so this creates two positive feedback loops, which as an engineer you understand, which means that they're self-feeding. And so the more that the process proceeds, the more it adds to itself. And so this is the simple term is a death spiral. And we can understand that as an interest payment on debt. Once you get to the point where we're spending 40% of the federal government spending is borrowed, then the interest payments start becoming larger. And then the solution from the state's point of view is to borrow more to pay the interest. And then what you get is where Japan is now, where their tax income only covers their Social Security and their interest payments. And the entire rest of their government has to be borrowed. And this is an extremely dangerous death spiral here, because Japan can only pull this off because its interest rate is like less than 1%. Now, if that interest rate went to 2%, Japan is instantly insolvent. And so the other feedback loop that's very, very destructive is that as the government takes more and more money to pay interest, it has to raise taxes, and it takes money away or starts competing with private sector investment. And so, unfortunately, the government does not have the feedback loops and a sense of consequence that the market does. So the government spends money and what we call malinvestments, the famous bridges to nowhere, or the latest fighter aircraft, $300 million each. The previous aircraft cost about 40 to 45, 50 million each. I mean, there's no limits on government spending. And so, and then if the government chooses to print money instead of borrowing it, then of course we have, it impoverishes all holders of the currency because it creates inflation and eventually hyperinflation.
What I see, Charles, from this, and good points, is when the government starts to interfere for various reasons that it thinks it needs to, it creates moral hazard. And so there's consequences where you have Greenspan's puts or Bernanke's put, etc., so that all of a sudden with that, your investment decisions and allocations of capital become distorted. And those distortions start to get greater and greater through the financial structure, so that eventually they spill over into the manufacturing examples, so that then you start to get malinvestment, as you're pointing out. But before you get malinvestment, you get mispricing. So you have moral hazard, then you get distortions, then you get malinvestment or mispricing, then you get malinvestment. And that's the road that we're on right now. And that's what happens when the government itself has to force policies, whether it's financial repression, a macroprudential strategy, but has to force things so that because it has to fund with smaller and smaller wealth creation and higher debt loads.
Yes.
And that's the roadmap that we put ourselves onto. And I think everybody knows that. But the problem is, once you're on it, how do you get off of it?
Yes. That is our challenge in the future.
Well, I would argue one of the ways of getting off it is for us individually, not the government, is to recognize that there's no free lunch, and that in fact there's a limit to the role of what the government should do and can do. When I leave the United States and I'm in countries that are more socialist in orientation, Charles, one of the things I notice in every conversation is how many times the word government will come up in any kind of context we're talking about. And it's always where they expect or relying on or look to the government to create a rule, a law, a regulation, or something where they're giving maybe not so much direction as they're setting the boundaries. And on the surface, that sounds, well, that needs to be done, but it starts to limit innovation, freedoms, opportunities to fail. And so there's this attitude, is what I'm trying to say, that creeps into the mentality, and that it reinforces and stops the cycle, stops us from saying, well, we'll cut government. You can't do it.
I think that dynamic you just described is a critical part of the coming, crises and global failure to rebalance the connection between economy and liberty and the state.
This ends part 1 of Statism with Charles Hugh Smith. It will continue with part 2.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.